On that morning, the studio lights were bright. The cameras already rolling as Kellyanne Conway prepared herself for what was supposed to be a regular political debate. She had been on countless shows, often commanding the stage with sharp words and forceful delivery, but this time was different. From the moment Representative Jasmine Crockett began speaking, something shifted in Kellyanne's posture. Her jaw tightened, her eyes narrowed, and she leaned slightly forward as though she had been waiting for her turn to unload. The host barely had time to finish moderating the exchange when Kellyanne suddenly raised her voice, cutting in with the type of energy that made everyone on set stop. Her words tumbled out, not as a debate, but as a scolding. Her tone laced with visible frustration. The panel had expected tough exchanges. That was the very nature of political television, but the sheer intensity of Kellyanne's outburst startled both the audience and her fellow panelists. She didn't simply argue against Jasmine's points. She screamed over them, repeating phrases with an edge that bordered on personal attack. The microphone picked up the rise in her volume, making it echo across the airwaves. Producers behind the cameras exchanged quick glances, knowing that live TV offered no opportunity for Kellyanne's outburst had already become part of the broadcast. People in the control room later admitted that in those tense minutes, it felt less like a debate and more like a storm. Kellyanne's voice rose above the usual tempo of conversation, pushing the discussion into uncomfortable territory. It was as if she believed that the sheer force of her volume could overpower the weight of Jasmine's calm statements. Her finger gestures, the sharp turn of her head toward the congresswoman, and the repeated interruptions turned what should have been a point-counterpoint into an unraveling display of raw emotion. Viewers watching at home immediately noticed the imbalance. Social media chatter started within minutes. As people began typing out reactions about how aggressively Kellyanne was coming across, some described it as shocking, others as unprofessional, and a few even admitted they had to turn down the volume on their televisions because of the sheer intensity of her shouting. The more she pushed, the more it became clear that her message, no matter how valid she believed it to be, was getting lost in the delivery. For Kellyanne. This was not unfamiliar territory. She had always been known for being forceful, sometimes sharp, often combative. But this particular exchange stood out because of how far she let the moment go. Instead of framing her points with conviction, her outbursts seemed to overshadow them. Every word she screamed seemed to chip away at her credibility, making it less about what she was saying and more about how she was saying it. Even the host, who had moderated countless debates, looked unsettled as he tried to steer her back toward civility. What made the scene even more striking was the silence that followed her louder moments. Each time she paused to take a breath, it was as though the room itself had emptied of oxygen. People expected Jasmine to fight back with the same volume. But instead, her silence in those moments highlighted just how intense Kellyanne's shouting had become. Without a counter-scream to balance it, the entire set was left echoing with Kellyanne's raised voice. Later, commentators replayed the clip, pointing out how rare it is for seasoned political figures to lose composure on national television in such a visible way. Analysts noted that while passion can energize a base, unchecked emotion often alienates undecided viewers who look for reason over rage. Kellyanne's choice to scream, rather than argue, had taken what could have been a strong point and buried it under a wave of noise. Her outburst became the first talking point in newsreels. Headlines did not focus on the substance of her argument, but on the fact that she screamed at her opponent. That became the shocking takeaway, the moment people remembered long after the program ended. And though she may have intended to project strength, the reaction told a different story. Strength had been mistaken for shouting, and shouting had drowned out the very point she wanted to make. Would you like me to expand Keynote 2 in the same 700-word storytelling style next? When Kellyanne Conway's voice filled the studio with sharp, heated words, all eyes naturally turned to Representative Jasmine Crockett. Viewers at home expected her to match that energy, to raise her tone and fire back in the kind of exchange that often becomes the highlight of political television. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She sat there, hands steady, her expression calm in the face of a storm. The cameras caught the contrast clearly. One voice shouting with rising intensity, the other figure waiting patiently, almost as if she knew that silence itself could be more powerful than noise. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, deliberate, and strikingly calm. There was no trace of irritation, no sign that she had been rattled. Instead of feeding into the energy of the outburst across the table, she lowered the temperature of the room with just a few carefully chosen words. She didn't need to shout to be heard. In fact, her calm tone made her words carry even further. Viewers leaned in, listening closely, because her composure demanded attention in a way that shouting never could. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she delivered it, as though she understood the power of restraint. Kellyanne's shouting had filled the air, but Jasmine's calm response cut through it like a knife. The studio atmosphere shifted instantly. The host, who had been struggling to manage the escalation, visibly relaxed at Jasmine's reply, sensing that she had restored a balance to the conversation. Panelists who had been caught off guard by Kellyanne's sudden loss of control seemed to reset themselves as Jasmine spoke. following her steady lead. Even the audience watching live seemed to notice the moment as something unusual, a reminder that calmness often holds more strength than volume. Asterisk, her reply wasn't long, nor was it complicated. It was short, sharp, and undeniably effective. By speaking in a tone that contrasted so sharply with Kellyanne's, Jasmine managed to make her points stand out with incredible clarity. She didn't have to dismantle every word shouted at her. Instead, she simply made her position clear, with no anger in her tone. That composure wasn't just strategy, it was a display of control, a refusal to let the outburst across the table dictate her own energy. Asterisk. The viral moment that spread later wasn't Kellyanne's raised voice but Jasmine's calm reply. Clips circulated online showing Kellyanne screaming one moment, followed by Jasmine's serene response that landed with more force than any shouted argument could. Social media praised her poise, calling it a masterclass in self-control. Memes highlighted the stark difference between the two women, one flustered and loud, the other collected and calm. The internet took Jasmine's words and repeated them again and again, proving that a steady voice could echo louder than a scream. Asterisk. In the hours that followed, commentators analyzed the exchange, noting how unusual it was to see someone remain so composed under such pressure. Political debates are often noisy, filled with interruptions and heightened emotions. But Jasmine's demeanor reminded viewers that composure can be its own form of power. She didn't just refuse to engage in shouting, she redefined the exchange by showing that control, not chaos, carries the final word. Asterisk. Kellyanne, in that moment, seemed to underestimate what calmness could achieve. While she tried to dominate the stage with her volume, Jasmine managed to dominate the narrative with her silence and then her steady words. It was a reversal of expectations, and the audience recognized it immediately. That reversal is what made the clip so memorable. People weren't surprised by shouting on TV, but they were surprised by how effective calmness could be when placed beside it. Asterisk. Jasmine's reply became more than just a soundbite, became a symbol. It was replayed not because of its length or complexity, but because it captured the essence of composure under fire. In a world where many expect arguments to be won by the loudest voice, her calm dismantling of Kellyanne's outburst showed that the opposite can be true. She didn't win the exchange by overpowering her opponent. She won it by refusing to let the shouting dictate her own approach. Asterisk. Would you like me to now expand Keynote 3 in the same storytelling tone for 700 words? The most striking thing about that exchange wasn't only Kellyanne Conway's raised voice or Jasmine Crockett's reply, it was the undeniable contrast between the two. On live television, where every second is amplified and replayed, the differences in tone and delivery became the real story. One side was loud, emotional, and relentless, while the other was measured, composed, and unwavering. That clash created a moment that viewers could not stop talking about. It wasn't just about the words being spoken, but about the way those words were carried into the world. The louder Kellyanne tried to be, the more powerful Jasmine's calmness appeared in comparison. Asterisk. When Kellyanne leaned forward, pointing and raising her voice, it gave the impression of urgency, even desperation. She believed her passion would dominate the conversation, but the very act of shouting undercut her point, as it left the impression that she had lost control of the room. Every syllable came out sharper than the last, and instead of drawing people toward her argument, it pushed them away. On the other side of the table, Jasmine's quiet control worked like a mirror reflecting back the imbalance. She didn't need to call out Kellyanne's tone directly. By remaining steady, she made it clear to everyone watching that she was not shaken, that the shouting was ineffective. Asterisk. This contrast turned the studio into a kind of stage where two different communication styles played out side by side. Kellyanne embodied chaos, while Jasmine embodied restraint. And in that clash, the audience naturally gravitated toward the one who appeared unbiased. Political debates often blur into a mix of overlapping voices, but in this case, the division was crystal clear. The shouting looked frantic. The calmness looked like strength. Viewers at home recognized it instantly, and that recognition spread across platforms within minutes. Asterisk. Analysts later described the moment as a study in contrasts. They pointed out how shouting often overshadows substance, while calmness tends to highlight it. Kellyanne had arguments she wanted to make, points she believed in, but by delivering them with such intensity, she made them secondary to her tone. Jasmine, on the other hand, didn't need to out-argue or out. She simply let the weight of the contrast work in her favor. By staying calm, she made the outburst seem even louder, even harsher than it already was. And that made her reply land with unexpected force. Asterisk. The power of that contrast became even clearer when clips circulated online. Side-by-side videos showed Kellyanne's raised voice paired with Jasmine's calm response, and the difference spoke louder than any caption could. Commenters didn't need to be told who won the exchange. The contrast told the story all on its own. The visual of a seasoned political figure losing control next to someone who remained composed was enough to spark thousands of reactions. People weren't replaying it to analyze policy points. They were replaying it because it was a perfect demonstration of how composure can dismantle chaos without a single raised word. Asterisk inside the studio, that contrast created a silence that lingered after Jasmine's reply. The shouting had been so sharp that when her calm words followed, they carried extra weight. Even the host seemed to pause, recognizing that the room had shifted. For a brief moment, it wasn't about questions or counterpoints. It was about how two entirely different energies had collided on live television. And in that collision, it was clear which one resonated more strongly. Asterisk Kellyanne's attempt to dominate by volume inadvertently highlighted Jasmine's strength. Without the shouting, Jasmine's calmness might have seemed ordinary. But set against that backdrop of noise, it appeared extraordinary. That's why the moment became viral, not because calmness alone is rare, but because calmness in the face of such visible aggression is unforgettable. It was the contrast that etched the moment into people's minds, turning what could have been just another panel debate into a cultural talking point. Asterisk, as the clip continued to circulate, more people began framing it not as a battle of words, but as a battle of styles. One side showed what happens when emotion overrides composure. The other showed the power of restraint when under pressure. That dynamic, that stark contrast, is what people remembered long after the show ended. It became an example repeated in articles, podcasts, and late-night commentary. When chaos meets calm on live TV, calm has a way of winning without ever raising its voice. Asterisk. Would you like me to continue by expanding Keynote 4 in the same style and length? The moment the segment ended, producers already knew what would happen next. In today's world, nothing controversial on live television stays within the studio walls. Clips are cut, shared, replayed, and dissected by millions in real time. That's exactly what happened here. Within minutes of Kellyanne Conway's outburst and Jasmine Crockett's .com reply, the footage had been uploaded and was spreading across social media platforms. But it wasn't the shouting that people kept repeating, it was the calm reply that drew the spotlight. Viewers were stunned at how icily Jasmine shifted the mood with a single composed response. And that surprise became the engine behind the viral wave. Asterisk, the public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Twitter feeds filled with short captions praising Jasmine's composure, many of them juxtaposed with screenshots of Kellyanne mid. Hashtags highlighting the exchange began trending. TikTok creators added dramatic pauses and music to Jasmine's reply, framing it as a moment of poetic justice. Memes emerged within hours, with images showing Kellyanne yelling on one side and Jasmine responding on the other with a line that needed no exaggeration to make its point. The internet had chosen the moment's defining image, and it wasn't the loudest voice in the room. Asterisk comment sections across platforms reflected the same sentiment. People wrote that they had expected chaos, but instead found themselves moved by calmness. Others noted how refreshing it was to see someone resist the temptation to raise their voice in return. For many, it wasn't just about politics. It was about seeing control triumph over disorder in a way that felt universally relatable. Parents compared it to arguments with children, employees compared it to workplace conflicts, and some even framed it as a life lesson, that sometimes the most powerful response is the quietest one. Asterisk, Kellyanne, however, became the unintended symbol of the opposite. Her shouting was replayed less as an argument and more as a spectacle. Every time the clip appeared online, it was framed not as her making a point, but as her losing her composure. The more it spread, the clearer it became that her intended message had been overshadowed by her delivery. She may have believed she was defending her stance with passion, but the public saw it as losing control on live television. In that contrast, Jasmine's calm reply looked even stronger. Asterisk news outlets quickly joined the conversation. Evening broadcasts replayed the clip and ran segments analyzing why it had resonated so strongly with viewers. Pundits on both sides of the political spectrum agreed on one thing: the calmness of Jasmine's reply carried more impact than anything else said during the program. Headlines captured the irony, noting that the viral success belonged not to the loudest voice, but to the quietest. Some editorial pieces even suggested that the moment had become a kind of metaphor for how people crave steadiness in an era of political noise. Asterisk, the public response didn't stop online. In community discussions, podcasts, and radio talk shows, people used the incident as an example of composure under fire. Commentators highlighted how rare it is in political debates to see someone resist the urge to fight back with equal intensity. It became a point of discussion far beyond politics, resonating with anyone who had ever faced confrontation. That universality is what gave the moment its lasting viral power. It wasn't just about Kellyanne Conway versus Jasmine Crockett. It was about the way people handle conflict when the stakes are high and the cameras are rolling. Asterisk for Jasmine. The response elevated her presence beyond the panel itself. She wasn't just the congresswoman who made a point. She was the congresswoman who became a symbol of calm strength in the middle of a heated exchange. Every repost and every comment amplified that image. Kellyanne, meanwhile, had to contend with the fact that her shouting had become background noise to the story of someone else's composure. The public's reaction made it clear. People remembered the calm reply, not the raised voice. Asterisk the viral spread of that clip cemented the idea that in an age where everything is broadcast, the style of delivery can matter more than the content of the message. Kellyanne may have entered the studio determined to dominate the conversation, but the audience decided who owned the moment. It wasn't the one yelling into the microphone. It was the one who refused to be pulled into the chaos, choosing instead to let calmness speak louder than anything else. Asterisk. Would you like me to now craft the 500-word ending statement that ties all 4 keynotes together in the same storytelling tone? What unfolded in that studio ended up being far bigger than a single debate segment. It showed, in real time, the difference between trying to dominate through volume and managing to lead through composure. Kellyanne Conway had come in with confidence, ready to press her arguments hard, but the way she delivered them ended up defining the exchange. Her shouting wasn't remembered for its substance, but for the way it looked and sounded on camera: urgent, abrasive, and uncontrolled. By contrast, Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond. She transformed the entire moment. Her calmness in the face of shouting reminded everyone watching that strength is not always loud, and that poise often carries more influence than passion delivered at full volume. Asterisk. The ripple effects of that moment revealed something deeper about the way people consume public exchanges today. Viewers aren't just listening to words, they are paying close attention to tone, body language, and the energy of the people speaking. When Kellyanne leaned forward and raised her voice, it created tension that many found uncomfortable. When Jasmine replied in a measured tone, it broke that tension, offering a release that resonated strongly with audiences. The internet magnified this reaction, turning a single reply into a viral example of how composure can silence chaos without raising its voice. Asterisk. What made the exchange powerful was not that it was unprecedented political shouting matches happen all the time, but that it flipped expectations. Audiences have grown accustomed to conflict on television being settled by who can be louder, faster, or more aggressive. This time, the opposite happened. The person who kept her cool was the one whose message was remembered, shared, and praised. The person who shouted the loudest was the one who lost control of the narrative. It was a reminder that in an era of constant noise, calmness itself has become rare enough to feel revolutionary when it appears on screen. Asterisk. Kellyanne became a cautionary example of how quickly a moment can slip away when emotion overrides composure. Jasmine became the example of how quickly a moment can be won when composure takes center stage. That contrast is what carried the story beyond politics into everyday conversations about conflict, leadership, and communication. People replayed it not because of the policies being debated, but because of the human dynamic on display. It was a case study in how two people can face the same situation in completely different ways, and how those choices shape what the world remembers. Asterisk. In the end, the incident was more than just a viral clip. It was a snapshot of a broader truth. In the loudest of times, the quietest voice often carries the furthest. What happened between Kellyanne Conway and Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a clash of perspectives, it was a clash of styles, and the calm reply will be the part of that story that continues to echo long after the shouting has faded. Asterisk. Would you like me to compile the 4 keynotes, plus ending into one continuous full story so it reads